Hey guys, tonight we begin with something special. We're diving into a world that looks ordinary on the outside, but was built on the slow ruin of human bodies. Factories that promised work, wages, and survival, but instead delivered sickness, fire, and silence. Before we step into tonight's story, take a second to like this video and subscribe, so these mysteries can reach others in your family too. And in the comments, tell me your location and the exact time you're watching this. It's always fascinating to see where you're tuning in from, almost like tiny lights glowing on a map across the world. Now, let's walk through a gate that very few who entered ever truly escaped. The morning begins not with sunlight, but with smoke. It curls low over the crooked rooftops of the East End, clinging to brick and gutter, painting the sky in the pale orange of an ember that refuses to die. The air carries a bite of coal ash, damp straw, and horse manure, but the workers have long ceased to notice. They trudge forward in silence, shawls pulled tight, boots scraping at cobblestones slick with yesterday's rain. Somewhere a bell tolls, not the sacred toll of a church, but the mechanical clang of a factory clock, calling the faithful into its iron congregation. Ahead looms the match factory, its walls rising like a fortress yet hollow, windows shuttered with grime, its chimneys yawning black clouds into the heavens. The building looks alive, but alive in the way a predator waits. Children, no taller than the gates themselves, stand in line with their mothers, shifting from foot to foot, fighting off the cold. Men with sunken cheeks lean against posts, gnawing at their nails. The young ones dare not whisper, the older ones no longer care. Their eyes remain fixed on the great iron gates that separate the street from the yard. And when those gates creak open, it is as though the morning itself is swallowed whole. The overseer stands just beyond the threshold, a ledger tucked beneath his arm. His coat is black, his collar stiff, and his gaze sweeps over the line with the indifference of a man counting cattle. One by one, names are muttered, scratches are made on the page, and bodies shuffle forward into the belly of the yard. Once inside, the gate slams shut behind them, cutting off the pale sun and muffling the noise of the street. The air changes too, thicker, sharper, stinking of phosphorus and sulfur, a smell that stings the nostrils and coats the throat. Here, the day belongs to the factory. The yard itself is bare save for crates and barrels stacked like barricades. Each barrel leaks powdery dust that glimmers faintly on the cobblestones. The dust clings to boots, skirts, skin, and hair. A child rubs at her sleeve, and it comes away yellow. A man sneezes, and his handkerchief returns streaked with the same sulphurous hue. The factory exhales it, endlessly, a slow poison that spreads like frost. Workers file toward the main door, a door so tall it resembles the entrance to a church. Its wooden planks are scarred by years of use, its hinges groan beneath the weight of countless mornings. Step inside, and the light of day vanishes, replaced by the amber glow of oil lamps hanging low over narrow corridors. The air hums with the sound of gears, pulleys, and distant coughing. This is not a place of beginnings. It is a place of endings disguised as labor. The first room is the dipping hall. Vast wooden trays filled with chemicals rest beneath long poles, strung with thin pine splints. The soon-to-be matches. Boys and girls no older than 12 lower the poles into the trays, lifting them again with practiced rhythm. The liquid hisses faintly as it clings to the wood, dripping back into the mixture. The children's fingers are stained, their nails brittle, their knuckles cracked. The stench here is overpowering, a mix of turpentine, glue, and the acrid bite of phosphorus. It burns the throat, sears the eyes, and yet the work continues, hour after hour, with only the occasional break to stretch or cough into a rag. Move deeper and the rooms narrow. The cutting benches line the walls, each station no more than a slab of wood and a knife dulled from constant use. Women hunch over the benches, slicing splints, their shoulders hunched, hair tied back in ragged scarves. Their hands move with desperate speed, for each pause risks the wrath of the overseer. Talk is rare here. Breath is better saved for the labor itself. From time to time, a groan escapes as a blade slips and skin opens, but no one looks up. A bleeding hand is bound in cloth, then put back to work. The factory thrives on silence, broken only by the scrape of knives, the coughs that echo through rafters, and the occasional cry when a barrel topples and the dust rises into the air like a golden storm. Workers choke and sputter, and for a moment the room is chaos. But as quickly as it begins, it ends. The dust settles, the overseer barks, and the rhythm resumes. Always the rhythm. Beyond lies the mixing chamber. Here, the phosphorus is heated, stirred, and spread across tables where matches are laid to dry. The chamber glows faintly in the dim light, as though it were lit from within by some malign flame. The workers here are the most marked. Their skin is pallid, their lips cracked, their teeth tinged yellow at the gums. The smell is worse here, almost metallic, a taste of rust and rot that seeps into clothing, into hair, into breath itself. It never washes out. Those who labour here carry the scent home, so that even their bedsheets reek of it, so that even their children smell the factory when they climb into their mother's arms. There is no escape. By midday, the workers move like shadows. Sweat has soaked their collars, their eyes sting, their hands tremble with fatigue. The bell that marks the meal break rings with a cruel cheer, and yet the food offered is meagre. Hunks of bread gone stale, a spoonful of broth, perhaps a slice of onion if fortune smiles. The phosphorus dust coats the bread before it reaches the mouth. Workers chew anyway, swallowing grit with each bite. The water tastes faintly of chemicals. Still, it is eaten in silence, for hunger is the greater enemy, and always the gates remain locked. From within the yard, the outside world feels like a rumour. The laughter of children playing in alleys, the clatter of carts on cobblestones, even the sound of church bells. These are faint echoes muffled by brick and iron. Inside the match factory, time bends. Minutes stretch, hours collapse. The body aches, but the mind has no clock to cling to, save for the bell that signals the end of a shift. Yet even that bell brings no relief, for the tolling comes far too late, after the body has already broken. For the newcomers, the first day is the hardest. Their eyes water constantly, their stomachs revolt at the stench, their heads pound as if gripped by invisible hands. Some faint before the day is half done, their bodies dragged to the side and doused with water before being shoved back to work. Others stagger toward the door at evening, coughing blood into rags, faces hollow, their youthful brightness dimmed to a dull flicker. It is in this way that the gate swallows the morning, taking in the hopeful, the desperate, the hungry, and spitting them back into the world as husks. Some never leave at all, their names crossed from the ledger with the same indifference with which they were once recorded. The factory does not weep for them. The overseer does not pause. The gates open again the next morning, and the line outside grows no shorter. Hunger drives them in, and phosphorus drives them out. You would not last a day here, not for the dust that chokes, nor the fumes that burn, nor the meals that poison. You would not last because the very air is hostile. The very walls seep venom. To enter this place is to surrender your body, to surrender your hours, to surrender your lungs, your teeth, your skin, until nothing remains but the faint yellow glow of the phosphorus, marking you as its own. The gate does not care who you are when you step inside. It swallows all mornings the same. Step further into the labyrinth of the match factory, and the world of individuals begins to dissolve. The air thickens, every breath scratching the throat, until workers seem less like people and more like shadows moving through a fog. Yet within that sulphur haze, faces emerge, faces marked by toil, etched by hunger, and already half consumed by the invisible poison that clings to every surface. The sulphur dust lies upon them like a second skin. It gathers in the corners of the eyes, seeps into the lines of the mouth, settles in the grooves of hands. When they smile, those smiles are rare. Their teeth glimmer faintly yellow, as though the factory itself has branded them. When they cough, and they cough often, the dust escapes their lungs in pale clouds, swirling like ghosts around their bodies. There are children here, their shoulders too narrow to bear the weight of the poles they lift. Their fingers raw from endless dipping. Their eyes are large, not from wonder, but from exhaustion, and their cheeks hollow in ways that speak of hunger more than youth. They should have been chasing hoops in the street, should have been throwing stones at the river's edge. Yet here they stand ankle-deep in powder, their skin turning the same sickly shade as the walls. A boy, no more than 10, bends beneath the strain of a bundle of splints. His lip is cracked, his teeth already showing the faint shimmer of rot at the gum line. He works in silence, for noise wastes breath, and breath is scarce in this chamber. When he stumbles, the overseer's stick cracks against the floor beside him, and the boy straightens with the reflex of a beaten animal. No reprimand is spoken, none is needed. Fear is a language all its own. Beside him, a girl barely taller than the tray she carries moves with startling precision. Her hair, once dark, is now threaded with pale streaks where the dust has settled like frost. She is quick, nimble, efficient, but her eyes tell the truth. They are glazed, weary, and watchful. She sees the faintest tremor in her companion's hand, the slow slump of a neighbor's shoulders, the subtle signs that the body is failing. She knows too well what follows. The sickness that creeps into the jaw, the swelling that deforms, the stench that no cloth can mask. She knows because she has seen it in others, because she fears she will see it in herself. The women here wear their labor on their faces. Their mouths are drawn tight, not by choice, but by pain. Their cheeks bear the grey pallor of skin starved of fresh air. They bend over benches, cutting, packing, pressing, each movement rehearsed 1,000 times. Yet it is their eyes that betray them most. Some stare ahead, unblinking, as though refusing to acknowledge the room around them. Others dart constantly, watching overseers, watching the dust, watching their neighbors collapse. Still others are dull, resigned, gazes fixed on some point beyond the walls, as if they had already left this place in spirit, though the body remains shackled to the bench. And then there are the men, those who still remain. Many have been driven away, forced into the streets by ruined jaws or broken bodies. But some linger, strong in frame but hollowed within. Their hands, once steady, now tremble. Their teeth, once white, crumble like chalk. They move with a slow certainty, less driven by orders than by the memory of orders long endured. Their faces are maps of scars and abscesses, flesh marked by the invisible battle against the fumes. When they speak, their voices are low and hoarse, words rasping through throats that burn with every breath. But among them all, it is the eyes that haunt. The sulfur dust clings not only to the skin, but to the gaze itself, dulling brightness, painting everything in shades of fatigue. A new worker's eyes shine with terror and disbelief, pupils darting, searching for escape. An old worker's eyes hold no shine at all, only the dim reflection of lamps swinging above. In those pupils, you can read the truth that few dare to speak. The match factory does not merely take time, it takes identity. Faces blur, voices fade, but the eyes remain as the last testimony of a spirit slowly extinguished. These corners, where the dust settles thickest, workers cough into rags spotted with red. They lean against barrels, their skin pus beneath the sulfur coating. And though they try to hide their weakness, the truth is written in their faces. One woman, once lively, now hides her jaw beneath a scarf, the swelling too grotesque to be seen. She avoids the gaze of others, but the smell betrays her, sharp and rotten, drifting through the room no matter how tightly she ties her cloth. Her co-workers avert their eyes out of mercy, or perhaps fear, for they know that the same fate waits for them, crouched just beyond tomorrow. The overseer strides through this world as though it were natural. He does not smell the rot. He has grown immune. He does not see the faces. To him they are numbers, strokes of a pen in a ledger that fills itself day after day. His own face is clean, untouched by sulfur, for he spends his hours standing above rather than working within. He is the priest of this toxic chapel, and the workers his silent congregation, heads bowed not in prayer but in submission. And yet, beneath the dust, there are flickers of humanity that refuse to be smothered. A boy shares a crust of bread with the girl beside him, their hands meeting for a moment of quiet solidarity. A woman hums under her breath, so softly that only those nearest hear it, the tune a memory of something far beyond these walls. An old man pauses to straighten the splints in a child's bundle, a small act of kindness that earns no thanks but lingers all the same. These are fragile rebellions, sparks in the dark, but they matter. They are reminders that the dust has not yet claimed all. Still, those sparks fade quickly. As the hours drag, fatigue burrows deeper. The dust grows thicker, the air sharper. Faces lose what little colour they held, replaced by the universal pallor of the poisoned. The sulphur is merciless, and it does not care for age or kindness. It settles equally on all, marking them, binding them, erasing them. By the end of the shift, when the bell groans at last, the workers stumble from their stations. Their faces are unrecognizable beneath the coating of powder. Children cough until their bodies shake. Women press rags to their mouths, eyes watering. Men stagger, bent, gripping walls for support. They pour out into the yard, but the air is no clearer here. The dust follows them, clinging, seeping into the seams of their clothes, into the cracks of their skin. And when the great gate opens once more, spilling them back into the pale evening, the faces remain hidden beneath their yellow veil. Mothers return home to their children as strangers. Husbands and wives sit in silence, unable to recognize the person across the table. In the glow of the hearth, in the shadows of their lodgings, they scrub and scrub at their cheeks, their hands, their hair. But the dust remains, embedded too deeply, staining not only their bodies, but their very being. It is said that you can always tell a matchworker by the glow of their face in the dark. A faint shimmer, unnatural, as though the sulphur has lit a candle within their skin. Some call it a curse, others a badge, but it is neither. It is simply the factory claiming its own, inscribing its mark upon those it has devoured. You would not last a day here, not because the labour is hard, though it is, but because the very air conspires against you. Because even before the body breaks, the face betrays you. The dust reveals what you would rather hide, your weakness, your hunger, your fear. It turns you into something unrecognizable, a shadow wearing your features. Step into this place, and you will soon see your own reflection blurred beneath the sulphur veil. And once blurred, it never sharpens again. When the day's work loosens its grip and the gates groan open once more, the workers step out into the evening air with bodies bent, but the factory does not release them. It follows. Not in chains, not in overseers' shouts, but in something far more insidious, the stench. It clings to them as they shuffle down narrow alleys, as they cross bridges slick with rain, as they duck beneath low arches where soot drips from stone. Passers-by wrinkle their noses and turn their heads, muttering, for the smell announces its victims long before their footsteps arrive. A sharp chemical tang, half sweet, half metallic, lingering with a stubbornness that no scrubbing can wash away. It seeps into the hair so that even a mother's embrace reeks of phosphorus. It nestles beneath fingernails so that even bread and butter taste of poison. The workers know it well, though they no longer flinch. They carry the odour as though it were another garment, invisible but weighty. They cannot leave it behind because it is no longer only on them. It is in them. The fumes breathe through their pores, sweat mingling with chemicals until the skin itself releases the stench. Those who labour too long in the mixing rooms, where vapours rise like steam, exude it with every exhalation. Their breath is an unholy incense, acrid and sharp, marking them as servants of the match flame even in sleep. Children recoil when their mothers kiss them goodnight, for the odour burns the nose and unsettles the stomach. Husbands sleep turned away from wives, the bedclothes pulled high, the foulness too strong to ignore. Neighbours whisper that matchworkers can be smelled before they are seen, that their very presence sours milk and ruins food. In taverns, when one enters, conversations falter, mugs are set down, and chairs scrape backward to create a distance between clean lungs and poisoned ones. The stench becomes a boundary, an invisible wall separating workers from the rest of the world. It marks them as unclean, unworthy, as if poverty itself had acquired a scent. Some wear scarves tightly wound about their faces as they walk home, though the fabric only soaks up the odour and carries it deeper into their clothing. Others bathe in basins with scalding water, scrubbing until the skin reddens and peels. Yet when they emerge, the smell rises anew, seeping from bone and blood, mocking the effort. No perfume disguises it. Lavender wilts beneath its bite. Rosewater surrenders. Even the pungent smoke of tobacco cannot mask it. Instead, the two odours mingle into something more revolting still. The workers resign themselves, though resignation does not dull the cruelty. They sit in crowded tenements, their rooms thick with the same stench. Whole families breathing the factory's ghost until no one can tell where it ends and the body begins. The poorest among them cannot afford soap, let alone remedies whispered about in markets. Boil nettles, some say. Soak the hands in vinegar. Carry a sprig of mint, but mint wilts. Vinegar fails. Nettles sting only the skin, while the odour remains untouched. Remedies belong to the realm of hope, and hope has little business in the match factory's orbit. Yet the stench is not only humiliation, it is a herald. Doctors, those rare few who stoop to examine the poor, speak of it as a warning sign, a shadow preceding a deeper illness. Once the smell grows strong, they mutter, the bones are already changing. For beneath the skin, the phosphorus creeps into marrow, gnaws at the jaw, hollows the skull. The odour is but the first messenger, announcing a decay yet to come. Workers who reek the most are those already doomed, their bodies betraying them with every breath. And so the stench becomes both stigma and prophecy. A woman reeks, and neighbours know she will not last the year. A man reeks, and his children begin to prepare for hunger. A child reeks, and pity wraps itself in silence. For the young are meant to smell of milk and soil, not of poison. The city itself seems to conspire against them. Rain does not cleanse but spreads the smell, turning streets into steaming channels of chemical water. Heat intensifies it, baking the odour into walls and garments. Even winter offers no mercy. Snowflakes catch the dust and dissolve into stink before they touch the ground. The stench is everywhere, a constant reminder that the factory has followed them home, curled up beside them in bed, pressed itself against their skin until escape is impossible. For the new worker, it is unbearable. They weep as they wash. They gag at their own breath. They stand in doorways too ashamed to enter their own homes. But shame grows heavy, and over time, it dulls into endurance. They learn to carry the smell as others carry scars or debts. Constant, unspoken, dragging. They no longer notice the sharpness, though others recoil. They no longer shrink when neighbours step aside. They know the truth. There is no washing away the factory once it has claimed you. The overseers mock it in cruel jest. You smell the profit, they say, as if the odour were a badge of labour, proof of worth. But there is no worth in it, only ruin. The stench isolates, humiliates, and announces the slow unravelling of flesh from bone. At night the workers dream not of fresh air or freedom, but of silence, of a moment when the nose does not burn, when the lungs do not heave, when the sheets do not stink of phosphorus. Yet even dreams betray them, for the smell follows into sleep, burrowing into the mind until nightmares are tinged with the same acrid haze. They awake gagging, their throats raw, only to realise it was no dream at all. And you, imagine yourself stepping into this world. Imagine the first sting of the air on your tongue, the bitter coat on your teeth. The way the stench worms into your hair so that strangers recoil. Imagine walking home, proud perhaps of the wages you've earned, only to have your neighbours turn their faces, children pinch their noses, your own family shrink from your embrace. Imagine scrubbing until your skin cracks, only to rise in the morning reeking worse than before. You would not last a day, not for the labour, nor the dust, nor the fumes alone, but for the inescapable mark upon your very being. The factory takes more than health. It steals the ability to pass unnoticed, to walk among others as one of them. It brands you with its odour, makes you carry its breath even when your lungs beg for clean air. The stench does not fade, not after work, not after bathing, not after sleep. It lingers until the body itself begins to rot, and then it deepens, mingling with decay, a sickly perfume of phosphorus and death. Long after the worker has left the gates, long after the ledger has scratched out their name, the smell remains in the rooms they lived in the rags they wore, in the very walls of their tenements. The city remembers them not with monuments, not with graves, but with a lingering foulness that whispers of the match flame's hidden cost. That is why you would not last. Because once you cross the gate, the factory does not only take your hours, it seeps into your pores, follows you home, and marks you forever with a stench that clings to skin and bone. In the first hours of a daylight, before the sun has risen high enough to warm the streets, the hands of the workers are already betraying them. The match factory does not wait until evening to take its toll. It begins its work at once, and it begins with the fingers. Those fingers, once delicate enough to cradle infants or pluck bread from an oven, are forced into endless motion. Splints lifted, dipped, packed, stacked, bound. The rhythm is relentless, and the materials merciless. Before the clock has struck noon, the skin is raw, stained with soot and resin, nails cracked from pressing wood into bundles slick with glue. Beneath the lamps, the workers' hands grow darker, as if charred from within. They are not burned by flame, but by contact, by the ceaseless touch of chemicals that seep past skin and lodge themselves beneath the nail beds. The powder sticks to sweat, clinging to palms until the skin feels as though it belongs not to flesh, but to stone. It grinds into every crease, turning knuckles black, staining fingertips so deeply that even washing cannot cleanse them. The workers soak their hands in water at brief intervals, but the water clouds instantly with filth, leaving a film that never truly lifts. What begins as discoloration soon hardens into sores, blisters raised and torn before they can heal. Children suffer first. Their skin is thin, tender, and ill-prepared for the corrosive bite of phosphorus. A boy, scarcely old enough to hold a tool, rubs his fingers against his trousers between tasks, trying to ease the sting, only to leave streaks of yellow and black across his already ragged clothes. A girl bites the edge of her thumb to relieve the itch, but the taste brings bile to her throat. Their small hands, meant for games and books, are instead ground down, splinter by splinter, until they resemble tools themselves, worn, blunted, used. Women's hands bear another cruelty. Many are mothers, their labour meant to feed mouths at home, yet the hands that cradle their children are the same hands steeped in poison. Babies turn away from their mother's touch, disturbed by the strange smell, the bitter film that lingers even after washing. Mothers cry quietly at night, ashamed of their own hands, ashamed that work has made them unfit even to comfort the very lives they are breaking themselves to protect. The men, those who still endure within these walls, hide their pain behind silence. Their fingers are thicker, calloused, but not invincible. They split, they bleed, they swell. A blackness grows beneath the nails, creeping like ink, until the nails themselves loosen and fall away. Some wrap their hands in rags, but rags soaked in phosphorus only hasten the rot. Others grit their teeth and continue, for stopping is unthinkable. To stop is to invite hunger, and hunger kills faster than pain. By mid-morning, the floor is littered with flecks of dried skin, bloodied rags discarded in corners, splinters snapped from tired grips. Yet the overseer strides past without slowing, eyes fixed on the pace of production. Fingers are tools, tools are expendable, and tools can be replaced. The ledger records bundles, not wounds. The workers learn to move despite their injuries, to twist the poles without bending swollen joints, to grip the knives, though the handles slick with blood. They become adept at ignoring the burn, at adjusting their grip when a finger will no longer bend. They adapt not out of resilience, but out of necessity. The factory demands motion, and motion must continue, whether with 5 fingers or 4, with whole nails or stubs. The cruelty lies not only in the damage itself, but in its swiftness. Before the church bells mark noon, the hands are already ruined for the day. The workers glance down at their own fingers with something between horror and resignation. They know what they see. The black creeping deeper, the nails softening, the skin weeping. They also know that this is only the beginning. Afternoon waits, with more hours of dipping and cutting, more barrels to carry, more trays to pack. The damage will double before dusk. Those who have endured longest bear marks that never fade. Their hands are disfigured, fingers twisted, knuckles swollen like knots in old wood. Some have stumps where digits once were, the loss hidden beneath cloth until revealed in sudden flashes as they work. The blackness becomes permanent, as if their flesh has absorbed the very darkness of the chemicals, a tattoo etched by labor itself. And still they continue, for the body may falter, but hunger drives it onward. The city recognizes these hands from afar. In markets, match workers are known by their blackened fingers, and sellers hesitate to accept coins from them, as though the very money carried the taint of phosphorus. Children on the streets whisper of the devil's hands, saying match workers could strike a flame simply by clapping. The cruelty of the jest hides the truth. The hands of these laborers are indeed marked by fire, though no flame is ever needed. At home, the hands cannot rest. They tremble as they try to lift spoons, spilling broth before it reaches the lips. They brush against sheets, leaving streaks of stain. They attempt to mend torn clothing, but the needle slips from unsteady fingers. Tasks once simple become trials, each gesture reminding them of the price paid before the sun has even reached its highest point. The blackening is not merely external. The phosphorus seeps deeper, burrowing into flesh and bone, hollowing from within. Pain radiates up the arms. Joints stiffen, muscles cramp. Workers speak of the sensation of heat in their very bones, as though their hands were burning though no flame is present. They soak them in cold water to no relief, for the fire is inside, untouchable. And what of you? Imagine bending over those trays, gripping the poles, cutting splints with a knife dulled by endless use. Imagine the sting that begins as a prick, then blossoms into an ache that never fades. Imagine lifting your hand to wipe sweat from your brow, only to smear soot and dust across your face. Imagine looking down before noon and seeing your own nails loosen, your own skin cracking, your own fingers blackening as though they belong to someone already dead. You would not last, because the body rebels against such cruelty. The skin cries out, the flesh withers. The hands that once served you faithfully betray you before the day is half spent. And unlike tools, unlike machines, you cannot simply replace them. Once blackened, they never truly recover. Once taken, they are lost forever. The match factory knows this. It counts on it. It consumes hands the way a flame consumes wood, without pause, without regret, always hungry for more. And before the bell tolls midday, it has already claimed its due. Among the workers, there are words no one wishes to hear spoken aloud. They pass them in murmurs, hushed tones between the clatter of trays and the scrape of knives. Words wrapped in fear, as though uttering them too loudly might summon the fate itself. Of all these, none carries more dread than the 2 syllables whispered when someone coughs too hard. or when the smell of rot becomes too strong to ignore. Phossy jaw. It begins quietly, like most horrors do. A toothache, no different from the kind born of too much sugar or too little care. A worker presses a hand to her cheek, wincing at the throb that comes each time she bites down. At first, she thinks little of it. Pain is constant here, and a sore tooth seems small compared to the blisters on her fingers, the black stains on her nails, the ache in her back. She works on, gritting her teeth against the hurt, until the tooth loosens and a swelling blooms along the gum. Soon, the swelling does not fade. Instead, it grows hard, the skin tight and red, the pain deepening until it radiates through the jaw, up the cheek, into the very skull. The breath begins to sour, carrying with it a stench so foul that even fellow workers step back. They know that smell. They have smelled it before, clinging to others who vanish soon after. It is the odor of death creeping through bone. The phosphorus has claimed another victim. The disease eats from the inside out, devouring jawbones as if they were tinder. First the teeth loosen, falling one by one until the gums bleed freely. Then the bone beneath begins to rot, turning to ash within the living flesh. The skin grows pale, the face misshapen, the pain unbearable. Ulcers bloom, oozing with infection. Some say you can see the jawbone glowing faintly in the dark, a ghastly lantern lit by the very substance that poisoned it. The sufferers try to hide it at first. They wrap scarves tight around their faces, mutter excuses for the smell, avoid speaking to others lest their rotting breath betray them. But secrets do not last long in the factory. Soon the whispers start, carried from bench to bench. She has it. He's marked. Another one with the jaw. Workers avert their eyes, not out of cruelty, but out of terror, for they know it is not contagious by touch. It is simply the fate of all who linger too long in this air. To look too closely is to glimpse their own future. Doctors are of little help. Some refuse to treat match workers at all, declaring them already lost. Others poke and prod, prescribing tooth extractions that do nothing but hasten the decay. Surgery is whispered about, a cutting away of the jaw itself, but few can afford it, and fewer survive. Most endure until the agony becomes too great, then disappear quietly, carried away from the factory floor, never to return. The overseers do not speak of it. To them, phossy jaw is not a tragedy but an inconvenience, a disruption to the rhythm of production. A name is crossed from the ledger, another recruited to take their place, and the wheel turns on. The sufferers are not mourned inside the gates. They are forgotten almost instantly, their absence filled by another desperate soul waiting outside in the cold. But the workers remember. They whisper the names at night, in crowded rooms where the air is thick with the same poisonous scent. They recall the hollow eyes, the muffled cries, the way someone once strong dwindled into shadow. The whispers serve as both warning and curse, a reminder that no matter how steady one's hands, no matter how silent one's endurance, the jaw can claim anyone. The disease does not wait for old age. It strikes children as easily as mothers, men as often as women. A boy of 14, his face swollen beyond recognition, keels over at his bench, blood pooling on the wood. A mother of 5 hides beneath a shawl in church, ashamed of the pus that stains her collar. A man who once laughed heartily at the tavern now keeps to himself, teeth gone, his smile a memory. Beyond the pain, it is the smell that isolates them most. Even family turns away. Children refuse kisses. Husbands and wives lie apart. Neighbours complain of the stench seeping through thin walls, driving the sick into corners where they cough alone, unvisited, unseen. The rotting is relentless, and the odour is its herald, announcing to all who pass that the phosphorus has eaten into living bone. And what does it feel like? This slow unravelling of the self. Imagine chewing until every bite feels like a shard of glass tearing through flesh. Imagine the heat of infection crawling through your skull, pressing against your temples until sleep is a stranger. Imagine opening your mouth to speak and feeling the jaw shift beneath your skin, fragile as tinder ready to snap. You would not last. Not a day, not an hour, not a moment, once the whispers began. For there is no defense, no shield, no bargain. The match factory plants the seed of decay the moment you breathe its air. And though it may take weeks, months, or years to bloom, bloom it will. Every worker knows this, even as they bow their heads and labor on. Each toothache, each swelling, each foul breath sparks fear, but fear cannot outweigh hunger. And so they work, even as the whispers circle closer, even as they wonder when their own name will be carried in hushed voices from bench to bench. There are graves without markers that tell this story better than ledgers ever could. Buried deep, away from churches that refuse the stinking dead, lie the bones of men and women whose jaws never followed them into the earth, carted off by surgeons or coroners' hands to be studied, displayed, prodded. Some say the bones still glow faintly, the phosphorus trapped within, a cruel souvenir of the labor that killed them. The whispers never fade. They cling to the factory walls, to the dust in the rafters, to the very matches themselves. Each strike of a flame carries the echo of a life consumed by the jaw, and those who light their fires in distant parlors and kitchens never know that behind the spark lies a face ruined, a mouth silenced, a body broken. That is why you would not last, not merely because the labor exhausts or the stench suffocates, but because in the very marrow of your being, the phosphorus waits to carve its mark. To step through the gates is to step onto a path where the jaw will one day whisper your name, and once whispered, there is no turning back. There is a kind of quiet in the match factory that does not belong to peace. It is the hush of workers who know how close they stand to sudden ruin. Every step, every breath, every careless scrape carries with it the possibility of disaster, for here the air itself has teeth. Phosphorus clings not only to the hands and faces of the living, but to the walls, the floors, the rafters, until the very building becomes a powder keg disguised as brick and timber. A match is a fragile thing, yet it is born of danger so complete that even its creation feels like a gamble with fate. Trays of splints, thin as bones, are dipped into the yellow poison, laid out to dry in rows upon rows like fields of brittle reeds. Around them, the workers move carefully, shoulders drawn in tight, sleeves rolled short, eyes fixed on their tasks. The dust glitters faintly in the shafts of morning light, as though the air itself were lined with sparks, waiting for a reason to awaken. It does not take much. A nail striking wood, the drag of a boot sole across grit, a cough too harsh, sending spittle onto a tray, the scrape of metal against stone. Each sound carries the weight of catastrophe. The workers have learned to move in silence, not for fear of overseers, but for fear of what silence broken might call forth. And still, sparks fall. No one ever sees the first one. It begins as a shimmer, a tiny flash at the edge of vision, like dust catching light. Then, in an instant, the shimmer becomes flame. It races across the drying racks faster than breath can carry a cry, consuming splints, trays, sleeves, hair. The phosphorus burns with a white fury, a brightness so sharp it blinds those nearest. For a moment, the world becomes a blizzard of fire, and then the screams follow. The overseers keep buckets of sand near the doors. But what is sand against such hunger? By the time the first handful hits the floor, the flame has already leapt from rack to rack, climbing walls, licking beams, filling the air with choking smoke. The workers do not shout instructions. They scatter, each person an island of terror, shoving, stumbling, clutching at throats as the fumes pour in. Those who are nearest the doors sometimes escape, their hair singed, their arms blistered, their lungs raw from the heat. But those deeper inside rarely make it out. The fire moves too quickly, the windows too high, the doors too few. Their bodies are later found in heaps, blackened together in corners where they tried to hide, or sprawled across the floor as though sleep had claimed them mid-step. The phosphorus leaves little behind but charred shadows. Not every spark becomes a blaze. More often, it is a brief flare, an ember that scorches a sleeve, a sudden hiss that singes hair. a glow that dies before it spreads. These are almost worse, for they keep everyone on edge, knowing how close each moment comes to ruin. A girl screams when her apron catches, beating it out with frantic hands. A man swears as smoke curls from his cuff, the fire leaving a mark upon his skin. A child drops his tray, the wood clattering, and all eyes snap to it, waiting to see if the noise will bring fire in its wake. The fear never leaves. It clings to them as tightly as the phosphorus dust clings to their clothes. Even when no fire burns, the scent of smoke lingers, a phantom reminder of how swiftly the factory can turn from workplace to pyre. And then there is the sound, not the roar of the blaze itself, that is mercifully rare, but the sharp, brittle crackle of splints igniting when they should not. It is a sound that slices through conversation, through thought, through breath itself. Workers freeze when they hear it, their hearts seizing as though struck. The crackle is always followed by the question that no one dares to speak aloud. Is this the one that will take us all? They have seen it happen enough to know it could. Whole buildings lost in an afternoon, flames visible for miles, smoke blotting out the sky. Neighbours gather to watch, to gape at the inferno, while inside the factory walls bones turn to ash. The papers write of it in a few lines, blaming carelessness, never naming the ones who burned. Their wages are docked even in death, their families left with nothing but grief, and the faint smell of phosphorus that lingers on the belongings returned to them. The workers know, though, they carry the memories in their silence, in the careful way they move, in the way they never quite meet one another's eyes when they smell smoke. They know that in this place, every spark is a question, and every day without fire is not safety, but borrowed time. There are scars among them that tell the truth better than ledgers ever could. A man with hands melted into claws, unable to hold a fork. A girl with hair half burned away, her scalp forever raw and tender. A woman whose skin is mottled with white patches, the ghost of flames that kissed her before receding. They walk among the living as reminders of how thin the line is between endurance and obliteration. The danger does not stay within the walls. Matches are carried out by the crate, by the barrel, by the wagon load. Streets rattle with their passing, homes fill with their scent, and still the sparks fall. A careless strike in a tavern, a drop box in a crowded market, a child curious with a flame. Each small accident carries with it the weight of the factory that birthed it. Whole tenements have gone up in smoke, lives erased in moments, all from a spark that fell like silent ash. But it is inside the factory that the fear is sharpest, because here the sparks are not accidents. They are inevitabilities. The air is too thick with poison, the wood too brittle, the hands too weary. Every hour brings another chance for ruin, and you, stepping through those gates, would not last. The stench might choke you, the dust might blind you, the toil might break you, but more than all of these, it would be the sparks, the tiny, merciless reminders that fire waits in every shadow. That would undo you. For how long could you work with your body tense, your breath held, your heart stuttering at each sound, knowing that at any moment a flare could consume not just you, but everyone around you? How long could you bear the silence, heavy with dread, broken only by the hiss of flame too near your skin? The workers bear it because they must. They have no choice but to gamble their lives against the hunger in their stomachs. They endure the constant terror, the burns, the losses, because beyond the gates lies hunger just as cruel. But you, unaccustomed to such bargains, untempered by such necessity, you would not endure the first spark. And when it came, you would see what they have seen. Fire that does not roar but screams, flames that do not warm but devour, sparks that fall not with sound but with silence, leaving only ash where once there were names, faces, and lives. When the factory doors yawned open each dawn, it was not only men and women who slipped inside. Small figures joined the shuffle, barely more than shadows, their heads hardly reaching the workbenches, their feet bare or stuffed into shoes too large. Children moved in silence through those gates, some no older than 7 or 8, their faces set into an expression far older than their years allowed. Their labor began where adult hands grew clumsy. Splints needed sorting, bundles needed tying, trays needed carrying. These were jobs too delicate for thick fingers and too constant for those already bent with fatigue. The overseers watched with keen eyes, knowing that a child's small frame could slip between rows of drying wood, that their nimble fingers could knot bundles quickly, that their bellies, empty and waiting, demanded no higher wage than a few coins or a scrap of bread at week's end. To watch them work is to feel the unease of seeing life misplaced. A boy crouched low to sweep phosphorus dust from the floor, coughing as clouds rose around him, his eyes watering, his lungs filling with the same poison that gnawed at the jaws of adults. A girl perched on a stool, tying matches into neat sheaves, her fingers raw and red, the skin peeling as though winter frost had bitten her though it was summer. Children learned quickly that hesitation had no place here. A dropped tray earned not only rebuke, but the crack of a belt across small shoulders. Slow hands were scolded with words sharp enough to sting deeper than blows. They moved with the instinct of the hunted, eyes darting to overseers, feet shuffling carefully to avoid sparks, shoulders tightening each time someone shouted. And yet, for all their care, it was the children who suffered most when flames found the air. Their small bodies could not outrun fire, nor push through the crush of panicked adults. When sparks hissed and trays flared, children were the first to vanish, their cries swallowed by the roar. They were light enough to burn quickly, fragile enough to leave little trace behind. Their absence was rarely noted beyond a line struck through a name in a ledger, their lives calculated as part of the cost of doing business. Even without flame, the factory hollowed them. Hunger gnawed at them more swiftly than at grown men, and phosphorus sank deeper into their thin blood. Teeth loosened sooner, skin blistered faster, bones weakened under the strain of carrying trays heavier than their arms could bear. They coughed through the nights in crowded rooms, their bodies twitching from dreams of fire, their breath already souring with decay before childhood had even left them. Some had been born into it. Their mothers worked at the benches, their fathers hauled crates, and when their small hands grew steady enough to hold a bundle, they too were led through the gate. It was said of some families that the factory raised them more than the hearth, that the air they breathed at home carried the same faint stench of phosphorus, that the sound of splints clattering was their lullaby. There were stories that spread like ghost tales among the workers, stories of children who seemed to glow faintly in the dark after long days in the dipping rooms, their hair catching the light as if dusted with embers. Mothers shushed these stories, but they whispered them still, unable to rid themselves of the image of a child marked by fire before ever striking a match. School was a distant dream. Lessons were replaced by repetition, tie, carry, sweep, dip. Numbers were learned not from chalkboards, but from counting coins that never stretched far enough. Words came in scraps from overheard prayers, muttered in exhaustion as bodies collapsed into sleep. Childhood in the factory's shadow was not a season but an accident, an interruption in the endless cycle of work, illness, and loss. Yet children laughed sometimes. It was perhaps the most haunting thing of all, a burst of giggles when one toppled a pile of splints, or a whispered joke passed down the rows, laughter that echoed strangely in a hall where the air reeked of sulphur and bone. They found games in scraps, drawing with dust on the floor, racing each other with bundles, balancing splints across thin fingers. But even their laughter was muted, as though they knew joy here was dangerous, that overseers scowled at any sound that did not serve the rhythm of production. When one of them fell ill, the change came swiftly. A girl who had once skipped lightly between trays now sat slumped on a stool, her face pale, her mouth swollen, her breath foul with the first signs of the jaw. A boy who once darted nimbly with armfuls of splints now dragged his feet, chest rattling with a cough too deep for someone so small. Their decline was sharper, crueler, as though the factory had no patience for youth. It devoured them with greater hunger. as if eager to remind all who watched that no one, not even the youngest, could escape its reach. And still more children came. Parents brought them when wages thinned, when rent pressed close, when hunger roared louder than fear. Some lied about ages. Some pleaded for the overseers to take them on. The factory never refused. Why would it? Small bodies cost little and broke quickly, leaving space for the next. The line at the gates never shortened. To see a child bent over a tray of phosphorus matches is to understand why you would not last a day here. The innocence of play, the breath of fresh air, the careless joy of sunlight. These are not simply luxuries denied, but dangers forgotten. In this place, childhood is not merely shortened, it is undone, twisted into something unrecognizable, shaped by fire and poison until nothing remains but labor and loss. The children fed the flames in more ways than one. Their hands kept the factory alive, bundling, carrying, sweeping, ensuring that matches reached the world beyond. But when sparks fell, it was often their bodies that fed the fire itself. Small, swift burning, uncounted, and their silence afterward was perhaps the loudest sound of all, lingering in the dust, in the corners, in the heavy air that pressed down on everyone left behind. The world outside lit its hearths, struck its matches, warmed its hands without ever knowing that in each flame flickered the shadow of a child who once labored, once laughed, once burned. And if you stepped into that hall, if you bent your own back beside theirs, you would feel it instantly, that the match in your hand was not just wood and poison, but the weight of stolen childhoods, fragile lives consumed to keep the world alight. You would not last because the sight alone would crush you before the fire ever had the chance. There was a bell in the factory, hung high above the floor. Its black mouth gaped like an unblinking eye, watching silently over the rows of workers. It was meant as a promise, though none trusted it. A rope coiled down from its clapper, frayed with use, thick with grime. The overseers claimed it was the guardian of lives, the first line of defense against disaster. But those who bent their backs beneath its gaze knew better. They called it the bell that lied. It was said the bell was to be rung at the first hint of danger, fire, collapse, any sudden calamity that threatened to devour the living whole. The overseers would declare, with all the solemnity of men who never touched the poison themselves, that the sound of it would send workers fleeing, that it was salvation cast in iron. Yet time and again, when sparks caught or rafters groaned, the rope hung still. The truth was simple. To pull it too soon was to invite rebuke from those who cared more for production than for lives. Matches drying on racks could not be abandoned easily. Machinery could not be left idle without profit bleeding away by the minute. To raise alarm was to halt the flow of coin, and that was a crime worse than smoke in the lungs. So the bell, more often than not, remained silent until fire had already swallowed its share, until screams had already reached higher than any clang of iron. Workers learned to measure its voice. A bell that rang quickly, at the first hiss of smoke, was a mercy, but such mercies were rare. More often, its voice was delayed, swinging into life only after flames had taken hold, when the air burned in throats, and the exits jammed with panicked bodies. The clang would echo across the factory floor, heavy and slow, not salvation, but dirge. It told not to warn, but to confirm what everyone already knew. The danger had arrived, and for many, it was already too late. There is cruelty in sound delayed. Imagine the swell of panic as smoke curled along the rafters, the faint crackle of igniting splints snapping like bones. Workers raised their heads, their eyes darting to the bell. The rope hung still. Seconds stretched, each one thick with dread, each one enough for flames to leap from tray to tray. They waited for the clang, knowing that only its voice gave permission to abandon the benches, to run, to shove past overseers and doors. Still, silence. By the time the bell's weight finally swung, chaos had already claimed the room. Its clang mixed with screams, with coughing, with the stampede of feet on wood. To hear it then was to understand not warning, but condemnation. The bell was no guardian. It was a judge arriving late to a sentence one she'd already carried out. The children knew this as well as the adults. They would freeze when smoke coiled low, their eyes fixed on the bell as though it were some idol holding their fates. The youngest sometimes clasped their hands together, whispering prayers to their iron mouth, as if their pleas might coax it into speech. But the bell had no loyalty to prayers or small hands. Its tongue moved only when profit allowed, and when it did, its sound did not guide but scatter. The clang was too loud, too sudden, reverberating through rafters and beams until it rattled in skulls. Panic sharpened. People shoved harder, tripping one another, clawing at doors. The exits became traps, the crush of bodies pressing so tightly that breath was lost before flame could touch skin. Some fell and were trampled before fire even reached them. The bell rang on, tolling overhead, drowning out cries until all that remained was the roar of the blaze itself. Afterward, when the ashes cooled and the smoke lifted, the overseers would point to the bell in their defense. It rang. They would insist, their words heavy with false gravity. The warning was given. If lives were lost, it was panic that killed them, not silence. The workers, those who had survived, would bow their heads and say nothing. To argue was to invite dismissal, but in their hearts they knew the truth. The bell did not save. It was never meant to. It was there so that those outside the gates could believe that precautions existed, that the factory cared enough to warn. The sound of it lingered even in dreams. Men and women woke in the night with their hearts racing, the echo of iron in their ears, the phantom taste of smoke on their tongues. Children whimpered in their sleep, clutching at blankets as though pressing toward a door that would not open. The clang of the bell became a wound that never healed, a sound stitched into the fabric of fear itself. Even on quiet days, when no fire burned, its presence was oppressive. Every glance upward was a reminder that salvation rested in a rope held by hands that valued coin more than flesh. Every cough of dust, every creak of timber, every faint spark carried with it the question, would the bell ring this time? And if so, would it be soon enough? The answer was always known, even if never spoken. It would not. It never was. And if you stepped into that hall, the weight of the bell would press upon you as surely as the stench of phosphorus. You would find yourself glancing upward as they did, your stomach tightening at each shift of light, each whisper of sound. You would wait for the clang, knowing that by the time it came, the air would already burn. The exits would already choke with bodies. You would not last, for you would see in that iron mouth not a promise, but a lie, and the lie would crush you long before fire had the chance. There is a particular cruelty in hope betrayed, in a sound meant to guide that only mourns. That was the bell's true song, not warning, not salvation, but the toll of lateness, of lives surrendered to hesitation, of flames already feasting. In the end, the bell was not a guardian at all. It was an accomplice. When the bell's echoes faded, the silence did not return. What replaced it was harsher, more insidious, the sound of lungs tearing themselves apart. You could hear it if you stood still, if you listened between the scraping of boots and the clatter of trays. A chorus of shallow breaths, punctuated by the wet rasp of coughs that shook thin shoulders and bent backs. The match factory was never silent. It was alive with the sound of dying. The air itself was treacherous. To breathe inside those walls was to invite poison into the body. Phosphorus dust clung to everything, trays, benches, the very fibers of clothing, and it rose with each movement like a fine, invisible fog. The lungs caught it greedily at first, pulling it deep, and the workers went on as though it were nothing more than air thickened by toil. But soon the coughing began, low and occasional, a nuisance dismissed with the wave of a hand. By the end of the week, the cough grew harsher, more persistent, rattling in the chest like pebbles in a jar. It was the sound of the body resisting, of blood vessels straining against the invasion. Many spat into rags or into the corners of the floor. the spit red or blackened, streaked with the evidence of what was slowly tearing them apart. No one remarked on it. To speak of blood was to invite acknowledgement, and acknowledgement was dangerous. Better to turn away, to pretend the crimson stains were nothing more than the dust itself. The overseers noticed, of course, but only when the coughing grew so loud it disrupted the rhythm of work. Their response was not mercy, but discipline. "Work through it," they snapped. "Keep your hands moving." A pause was theft, and theft could not be tolerated. A cough that rattled the ribs might earn only a glare. A cough that bent the body in half might earn a strike. There was no time for weakness, no allowance for flesh that gave out before the shift's end, and so the workers did not stop. They straightened their backs after each fit, their faces flushed, their chests heaving, and they pressed on. To falter was to risk dismissal, and dismissal was its own death sentence. Outside the gates, there was no shelter, no bread, no coin. Better to cough within the walls than starve beyond them. Better to choke slowly than freeze quickly. At first, the children seemed immune, their small bodies fueled by the cruel resilience of youth. But the dust found them too, creeping into their lungs, wearing them down one cough at a time. You could hear them in the corners, their thin frames trembling as they tried to stifle the sound. Some pressed rags to their mouths to muffle the noise, as though hiding it would protect them. But the cloth only came away stained. They learned quickly not to show it. A child who coughed too much was a child replaced. The coughing carried a smell, metallic and sour, that clung to the air like a second skin. The floor bore witness, streaked with spots of red that no amount of sweeping could erase. Shadows passed over them each day, men and women stepping around the stains as though they were not there. But they remained, silent reminders of the price exacted by each breath. At night, the coughing followed them home. In the narrow rooms and crowded tenements, families listened to one another tear themselves apart in the dark. A mother's cough answered a child's, a father's rasp echoed by the wheeze of a daughter. The sound filled the streets, bleeding from window to window, until the whole quarter seemed to hack and gasp in unison. It was a symphony of decay, rising and falling like the tide, unending. There were those who tried to fight it. Herbal teas brewed in chipped mugs, cloths soaked in vinegar and pressed against mouths, prayers whispered into pillows. Some swore by gargling salt water, others by inhaling steam over boiling pots. The remedies varied, but none prevailed. The cough was patient, relentless. It returned stronger each morning, as if mocking the feeble defenses. In time, the coughing grew violent enough to draw blood not just from the mouth but from the lungs themselves. Workers staggered, doubled over as scarlet threads stained their lips. Some wiped it away quickly, hiding the evidence before overseers could see. Others collapsed, their bodies racked by spasms, the factory floor darkening beneath them. Those were carried out swiftly, sometimes with little more than a sheet tossed over their frames. Their absence filled before the dust settled again. The survivors called them shadows, shadows that coughed blood, for that was what they became. Figures fading from flesh to silhouette, dimming each day as the coughing carved pieces from them. You could see it in their faces, hollowed by exhaustion, their eyes rimmed red, their skin grey beneath the layers of dust. They moved like phantoms, half present, their bodies labouring while their breath faltered. And yet, despite the sight, despite the sound, the work never ceased. The shadows bent their backs, their trembling hands still dipping splints, still stacking trays, still feeding the insatiable hunger of the match machines. To stop was to die in another way. So they continued, coughing into rags, spitting into corners, staining the air with the iron tang of blood. It is here that you would falter. Step into that hall, breathe once, twice, and already your chest would tighten. The dust would cling to your throat, scratch at your lungs. By the hour's end, you would cough, at first lightly, then with force enough to bend you. Your stomach would twist with the taste of iron, your head spinning from the lack of air. By midday, your hands would tremble, your vision blur. You would see the shadows around you, Men, women, children, moving through the fog as though it were ordinary, but it would not be ordinary to you. It would feel like drowning in plain sight. And that is why you would not last. Not because of fire, not because of accident, but because of the slow, steady betrayal of breath itself. The air in that place was not air. It was poison, invisible and patient, waiting in every corner, waiting with every inhale. It made shadows of the living, carved them hollow, drained them until their coughs carried blood. The bell could not save them from this. No clang of iron warned against the danger that lay in every breath. There was no alarm, no signal, no escape, only the coughing, louder each day, until it was all that remained. And when night fell, and the streets filled with its echo, it was as though the factory itself had followed them home, spreading through their lungs, their walls, their dreams. There was no leaving it behind. The match factory did not end at its gates. It lived in their bodies, in their blood, in the shadows they became. Hunger followed them as faithfully as the cough. It gnawed in the belly from dawn until long past dusk, a companion as constant as the dust in the lungs. Meals existed in name only, a parody of nourishment set down in bowls that mocked the very word food. To eat in the match factory's shadow was not to feed but to prolong. Bread was the staple, if one could still call it that. Loaves bought with meagre wages were stiff before they reached the table, their crusts harder than the benches on which men and women sat. Break a piece, and it did not tear. It crumbled, dissolving into a fine grit between the teeth. Each mouthful felt like chewing stone ground too roughly, a chalky residue that coated the tongue and clung stubbornly to the throat. Many chewed slowly, carefully, so as not to break what few teeth the phosphorus had not already loosened. Others swallowed quickly, eager to be done with it, though the lumps sat heavy in the gut, expanding like plaster. Soups were thin, more water than substance. A carrot shaved down to translucent slivers. A potato diced so fine it vanished before the ladle reached the bowl. The liquid itself carried the faint tang of smoke, as though even the water had been touched by the fires of the drying rooms. Those who ate did so not with anticipation but with resignation, sipping at the warmth only because an empty stomach left one weaker at the bench. Meat was a rarity, its presence more unsettling than its absence. A scrap of gristle, a rind of fat, a piece so stringy it caught in the teeth like rope. When such things appeared, they were swallowed quickly, for to linger was to taste too much. The rancid edge of rot, the unmistakable sourness of flesh kept past its time. Yet even then, the body accepted what it was given, desperate for anything that might stave off the dizziness that came from standing too long on an empty stomach. And yet, it was not only poverty that turned food to ash. The dust itself followed them to the table, invisible, inescapable. Phosphorus clung to the skin, the hair, the rags they wore, settling into creases and folds. No amount of rinsing rid the hands of it. Workers brought it home in the grooves of their nails, the seams of their cuffs, the lines of their palms. When bread was lifted, dust fell with it. When soup was stirred, powder mingled with the steam. Meals were seasoned with poison, each bite carrying a bitterness no spice could mask. Children noticed it first. They complained of the taste, wrinkling their noses, spitting out mouthfuls that seemed too sharp, too acrid. Mothers hushed them quickly, urging them to swallow, reminding them that to waste was to starve. But the little ones were not wrong. The food did taste of phosphorus, metallic and strange, a tang that coated the teeth and lingered long after the bowls were empty. The factory did not merely own their hours, it invaded their meals, turned sustenance into sickness. There were stories, too many to ignore, of families sitting down to eat and rising with nausea twisting their insides. Bread lay heavy, soup curdled in the stomach, and soon the retching began. Some swore the dust itself bred inside them, multiplying until it forced its way out. Others whispered that the factory liked to remind them it could choke them even in their homes, even at their tables. Whatever the truth, it was undeniable. Food that should have restored strength often drained it instead, leaving them weaker than before. Teeth suffered worst of all. Already loosened by the slow rot of the jaw, they cracked easily under the strain of hard crusts. Workers spat fragments into rags, pressing their tongues against the sudden gaps, the gums tender and bleeding. To chew was to gamble. Each meal another chance to lose what little remained of the mouth's defenses. Soon many swallowed bread unchewed, forcing it down whole, the lumps scraping at the throat. And when teeth were gone, the humiliation deepened. Adults gnawed like infants, tearing bread into softened scraps with sore gums. Their jaws ached, their faces hollowed, yet they persisted. To eat without teeth was agony, but not to eat at all was worse. You could see it in their cheeks, sunken and pale, the lines etched deep by hunger. Food no longer nourished, it tormented. There were moments of bitter irony. Sometimes wages were paid not in coin, but in food itself. Loaves handed out at the gate, hard as wood, wrapped in paper already stained with dust. The overseers called it charity, as though it were generosity rather than convenience. Workers accepted the loaves silently, carrying them home like trophies, though each knew it was a cruelty disguised as mercy. Bread was cheaper than coin, and what better way to ensure obedience than to control both labor and hunger? The body betrayed itself in time. Stomach swelled oddly, not with strength, but with bloating, as though the organs had grown tired of trying to draw sustenance from powder. Skin stretched over bones, tight and fragile, while eyes sank deep into sockets. Many moved through the factory in a state of constant dizziness, their limbs trembling, their steps unsteady. They learned to brace themselves against benches, to lean into walls, to feign steadiness while their insides screamed for nourishment. You would feel it too, if you sat at their tables. The bread would turn to grit on your tongue, the soup would taste of ash, and your stomach would twist with each swallow. By the third bite, you would gag, your body rejecting what your hunger demanded. By the fourth, your head would swim, your skin clammy, your mouth dry though liquid past your lips. You would rise from the table weaker than you sat, trembling from the effort of digestion. You would not last a day, and yet they did, somehow. They rose each morning with bellies half empty, with throats raw, with teeth broken and jaws aching. They rose because there was no other choice. Hunger was not reason enough to stop. Hunger was expected, ordinary, a constant companion. It became background noise, like the coughing, like the clang of the bell. But the cruelty lay in the knowledge that food, which should have sustained, became another instrument of suffering. Meals did not heal, they prolonged. They stretched the line of endurance just far enough to keep hands moving, just far enough to keep benches filled. The factory had no need of strong workers. It required only workers who could survive one more day, then one more after that, until even survival gave out. In the match factory's world, bread was not bread, soup was not soup, and meals were not salvation. They were powder, ashes in disguise, feeding the body only enough to keep it tethered to labor. It was sustenance turned to torment, hope turned to dust. And when you sat at that table, lifting that crust, tasting that bitterness, you would understand. It was not the flames alone that consumed them. It was not the cough alone that hollowed them. It was hunger itself, twisted and poisoned, turned into yet another weapon. That was the meal in the match factory, the meal that turned to powder. The sound of coughing was often drowned out by another sound, small, sharp, unmistakable. The faint crack of enamel surrendering, the brittle snap of a molar forced beyond its strength. It came suddenly, sometimes in mid-bite of stale bread, sometimes while grinding grit and splinters of dust between the jaws. A worker would pause, eyes wide, before spitting into their hand or rag. What emerged was not phlegm, not blood, but teeth. White at first, then yellowed, then blackened fragments slipping from the mouth as though the body itself were discarding what it no longer had use for. The match factory did not only consume lungs, it gnawed slowly at the mouth, rotting gums, and softening bone, until even the strongest jaws began to crumble. Teeth, once so ordinary, became fragile things, fragile as glass left too long in the sun. One by one they fell, sometimes whole, more often in pieces, scattering across the wooden floor with the same casual inevitability as ash. The overseers did not look down when they crunched underfoot. They ground them into the planks without pause, treating them as no more significant than stray splinters. A floor littered with teeth was simply proof that the benches were full, that the work continued. Teeth were expendable, matches were not. For the workers, the loss was more than physical. Teeth were dignity. To smile, even in hardship, was to remind oneself of being human. But in the factory, smiles disappeared as quickly as enamel. Mouths hollowed into grimaces, lips drawn tight to hide the gaps, laughter stifled for fear of exposing the ruin within. The factory erased joy, not with whips or chains, but with rot that crept silently through the gums. The children noticed first, when teeth fell from their own mouths. They would finger the small gaps with tongues, confused by the difference between the milk teeth they were told would vanish naturally and the strange, aching void left behind by decay. These were not teeth meant to go. These were teeth torn from them by poison, years before time decreed they should loosen. Some wept quietly when the pain grew too sharp. Others swallowed their cries, knowing a child who could not chew would soon be replaced. There were no dentists for the poor. There were no soothing powders, no skilled hands to draw out the pain. Extraction, when it came, was brutal and improvised. A cloth wrapped around the tooth, a yank with pliers or bare fingers, the scream muffled quickly lest it disturb the rhythm of the workshop. More often, the teeth simply fell of their own accord, pushed loose by swelling gums that bled and festered. The floor became an archive of suffering. Between the shavings of wood and the scatter of phosphorus dust, small white fragments gleamed dully. They lay forgotten, kicked aside by boots, swept half-heartedly into corners. No one stooped to gather them. To pause for such a thing was to risk the overseer's whip or dismissal. So they remained, a quiet litter of bones shed piece by piece, reminders that the factory did not need the whole of a person, only their hands. Eating became agony. Bread scraped like glass across bare gums. Soup burned against inflamed flesh. And even water stung when it touched the raw holes left behind. Some workers mashed their food with spoons, softening it into paste, swallowing it with difficulty. Others gave up chewing altogether, forcing chunks down their throats in silence, eyes watering from the strain. They lived in constant pain, their faces hollow, their jaws sunken, their speech slurred. Yet still they worked. You could hear it in their voices, a lisp where teeth once guided sound, a whistle where gaps had opened wide. Conversations on the factory floor carried the music of ruin, each word reshaped by absence. Some learned to speak less, ashamed of how their mouths betrayed them. Others grew hoarse from trying to force clarity through broken jaws. Language itself began to decay, reduced to whispers, nods, gestures. And then there was the smell. Infection followed quickly once teeth were gone. Gums swelled, abscesses formed, pus seeped into the mouth. The stench of rot clung to breath, sour and heavy, mingling with the omnipresent phosphorus. Workers leaned away from one another, not from cruelty, but from necessity, unable to bear the odor of slow decay, rising with each exhale. The factory was not only filled with the smell of chemicals, it was filled with the scent of mouths collapsing inward. Some did not survive the rot. The infection spread from gums to jaw, from jaw to blood. Fever took them quickly, their bodies burning even as their mouths festered. They were carried out silently, another body gone, another bench soon to be filled. Their teeth remained behind, scattered on the floor, silent markers of their labor. You would feel it too, if you stood among them. Bite into their bread, and a molar would snap like brittle wood. The pain would lance up your jaw, your gums swelling until the simplest swallow became torment. You would spit blood, feel the taste of iron coat your tongue. By nightfall, you would be tonguing the loose fragment of another tooth, waiting for it to fall, dreading the moment it did. You would not last. Not with your mouth dissolving into ruin, not with every bite a reminder of how swiftly the body surrendered. And yet, they endured. They spat fragments into rags and carried on. They pressed their jaws together against the ache, their eyes watering, their hands never pausing in their work. They endured because endurance was demanded. Pain was not permission to stop. Teeth could be lost, but the match factory still required hands. The floor told the story better than any words. Step across it, and your boot might press down on something that cracked beneath your weight. You would look, expecting splinter or nail, but it would be neither. It would be the molar of a man long gone, the canine of a woman bent at her bench, the milk tooth of a child too small to understand why their mouth ached so fiercely. The floor was a graveyard without graves, a place where the dead left pieces of themselves behind long before their final breath. And as the overseers walked across it, indifferent, as the workers bent above it, silent, the truth became undeniable. The factory did not simply take lives. It consumed them in fragments. Lungs first, then teeth, then jaws, then the rest. Teeth scattered on the workshop floor were proof not of weakness, but of survival. Each fragment was a marker of one more day endured, one more day given to the fire, one more day stolen from the body. But survival could not last forever. The floor grew heavier with fragments, the workers lighter with loss, until in time there was little left to give. That was the match factory's hunger, not sudden, not merciful, but slow and deliberate. A hunger that fed on the body one piece at a time, until nothing remained but dust, fragments, and silence. And if you entered that place, you would not last. The floor itself would remind you of what awaited. Your teeth, scattered among theirs, ground into the wood, forgotten before your body even had the chance to follow. In a place where everything was made to burn, fire was not an intruder. It was a tenant, patient, lingering in the rafters, nesting in the dust, sleeping in the splints of wood stacked higher than men. The match factory did not wait for flames to be born. It carried them already in its marrow. The danger was not if a blaze would come, but when and who it would choose to devour. The irony was cruel. The workers who spent their days coaxing flame into being, soaking, dipping, drying, cutting, did not need a match to light their world. The air itself was kindling. A single careless step, a nail dragged across wood, a tray set down too hard. Each could birth a spark, and the factory, greedy and dry, welcomed sparks as a starving man welcomes bread. The powder was everywhere. Not flour, though it looked like it, but phosphorus and sulfur, ground fine, clinging to beams and benches, softening into the cracks of the floor. It rose with each motion, invisible until sunlight slanted through, revealing golden streams like dust caught in a cathedral's air. Beautiful, some might have said, had it not been a beauty laced with terror. For each glittering mote could ignite. Each shimmering thread was a fuse waiting to be touched. The workers moved carefully, not out of choice, but of survival. Boots scuffed quietly, hands placed tools with caution, breath sometimes held when trays were shifted. Yet no care could erase the truth. The factory was a lantern waiting to be tipped. It did not need matches to burn. It was already burning in silence. The smell betrayed it first. On some days, the tang of phosphorus grew sharper, heavier, stinging the nose until eyes watered. Workers exchanged glances without words, their throats tight with dread. They knew that smell meant the air was fat with fuel, that even a breath might carry too much weight. Still, the overseers pressed them on. Orders shouted, whips cracked, and the fragile dance continued, each movement brushing the edge of disaster. And then came the sparks, not dramatic at first, just the small hiss of friction where iron struck wood, the tiny glow when a nail scraped across stone. To others, such sparks would vanish harmlessly. Here, they lingered alive, seeking. Workers froze when they saw them, eyes wide, praying the air would not feed them. Sometimes the sparks died, their glow fading into black. Other times they caught, When fire took hold, it moved faster than thought. A tray of matches became a torch in seconds. A stack of splints turned into a tower of flame. The phosphorus flared white, brighter than daylight, blinding those who dared to look. Heat roared outward, swallowing air, clawing at lungs before hands could even rise to shield faces. The bell, when it rang, was useless. Flames moved quicker than ropes could be pulled, quicker than feet could run. Workers stumbled, some toward the doors, others deeper inside where shadows seemed safer. But there was no safety, not in a house built of tinder, not in walls soaked with poison. Fire leapt from bench to rafter, from beam to beam, until the whole place glowed as though lit from within. Screams carried less than crackling. Flesh and wood alike fed the blaze, indistinguishable in its hunger. Some collapsed before fire even touched them, the air itself searing their throats, robbing their bodies of breath. Others ran until heat overtook them, their clothes sparking, their hair igniting like kindling. In the chaos, the bell tolled over and over, each clang mocking the futility of flight. And when, at last, the fire died, what remained was not silence but whispers. Workers returned the next day, new ones if the old had perished, and saw the blackened beams, the ashes thick as snow. The overseers called it an accident. They spoke of caution, of vigilance, of the need to move faster, work harder, replace what was lost. The fire became not a tragedy, but a tally, another line in the ledger of production. But the survivors knew the truth. Fire was not an accident. Fire was the factory's second heartbeat. It pulsed in the walls, in the dust, in the very breath of those who labored there. It waited with patience, biding its time, needing no struck match to summon it. Even on days when no flames rose, workers felt its presence. The air was warmer than it should be, as though heat seeped from the earth itself. The dust shimmered, catching light in ways that made eyes ache. Sweat clung to the skin constantly, dripping into eyes, stinging wounds, soaking the rags they wore. Every inhale carried the taste of ash, whether or not something had burned. Fire did not need to blaze to be felt. It was there, always, pressing on lungs, tightening throats, reminding them of what waited. Some grew so accustomed that they forgot fear. They moved among sparks as though invincible, shrugging at the hiss of friction, laughing bitterly at the acrid smell. Others lived in constant dread, flinching at the smallest scrape, trembling when the sun slanted just right through the dust. Neither group was safe. Fire chose its victims without preference, consuming the cautious and the careless alike. And if you stood there, among them, you would feel it too. Your skin would prickle though no flame touched it. Your throat would dry as though smoke already filled it. You would watch the dust shimmer in the air and know, with a certainty that no overseer could erase, that each speck was a spark unborn. You would not last, not with the knowledge that the floor beneath you, the air around you, even your own breath, carried fire waiting to wake. The cruelty lay not in the flames themselves, but in their inevitability. A place where matches were born could not escape burning. The factory did not fear fire. It expected it, welcomed it, counted on it. For every blaze that took lives, another crew was waiting, another shift prepared to replace what had been lost. Fire was not disaster, it was routine. And so the workers lived each day beneath a sentence unspoken. They carried trays with the knowledge that their own steps might summon flame. They dipped splints with the certainty that their hands might become torches. They breathed poison with the understanding that the next spark might be their last. That was the match factory's truth. Fire that never needed striking. It was already there, already waiting, already burning in silence. To walk through those gates was to step into a place where death glowed quietly, biding its time. And you would not last a day. Sleep was the first luxury stripped from the matchworkers. Long before food, before comfort, before safety, it was rest that disappeared. The factory demanded too much of their bodies and more of their hours. Night and day blurred into one another, until time itself became a trick of the overseer's whistle. The shift began before dawn, when frost still clung to the cobblestones outside, and ended long after the lamps in the city streets were extinguished. Some said the match factory had no clock of its own, for the ticking of hours would have been a mercy. Instead, it lived by rhythm. Trays lifted and set down, splints dipped and dried, sulfur brushed, phosphorus pressed. Each task was the beat of a drum that never stopped, and the workers moved to it until their bones hummed with exhaustion. But even when the bell finally released them, sleep did not come easily. The smell followed them home, clinging to hair and clothes, pressing into skin so deeply that water could not wash it away. They lay in narrow beds, eyes burning from fumes, throats raw from dust, and still the air seemed to smoulder. The factory was not a place they left. It was a shadow stitched to their bodies. Some tried to close their eyes, but images flared behind their lids. Sparks blossomed in the dark like tiny suns. Faces of fellow workers, ashen, jaw swollen, teeth missing, hovered in the silence, their mouths opening and closing with soundless cries. The brain refused to believe it was safe, refused to slip into the softness of sleep. Every creak of the floorboard became fire. Every cough in the next room became a scream. There were those who stopped trying altogether. They sat upright on their beds, backs bent like old men, though they were still children, staring into the darkness until dawn came again. Their eyes burned red, veins etched across the whites like rivers on a map. They blinked rarely, as though afraid that if they did, they might not open them again. Exhaustion became a companion, whispering in their ears, tugging at their heads, but never quite succeeding in dragging them under. The overseers noticed, of course. They saw the hollow stares, the trembling hands, the staggering steps. But instead of pity, they demanded more. Fatigue was no excuse. In fact, it was a convenience. Tired workers made fewer protests. Their movements slowed, their questions ceased, their rebellion dulled into silence. The sleepless were obedient, and obedience was more valuable than health. So the days stretched longer, the nights shorter. Some shifts never ended at all. When orders piled up, the bell did not ring at dusk. Instead, lanterns were lit inside the factory, their yellow glow trembling through the phosphorus haze. Workers stayed at their benches, swaying, dipping, cutting, stacking, their heads jerking forward and back as their bodies fought against collapse. Eyes stared unblinking into the glow until vision blurred, until hands moved without guidance, until thought itself dissolved into repetition. And then came the accidents. A child, too weary to notice, leaned too close to a tray. A man, half asleep, dropped a splint at the wrong angle. A woman, her head nodding, brushed her sleeve across a drying rack. The smallest misstep, born not of negligence but of exhaustion, summoned sparks, and the sparks fed the flames. Those who survived fire carried the scars, not only on skin, but in memory. Their dreams, when sleep finally came, were filled with smoke. They woke coughing, gasping, clawing at their own throats, as if flames still clung there. Sleep offered no peace. It became another chamber of the factory, another shift where eyes refused to close even in rest. The children suffered most. Their bodies were small, their strength slight, and the weight of endless hours bent them quickly. They drooped like wilting flowers, their heads heavy, their spines curved. Some fell asleep standing, their knees buckling, their foreheads striking the benches with a dull crack. Blood mixed with phosphorus dust, and the overseers dragged them upright, thrusting tools back into their hands. Tears burned tracks through the sulfur grime on their cheeks, but their eyes still would not close. They had learned that to fall asleep was to risk not waking again. It became a kind of curse, this sleeplessness. The workers' eyes grew glassy, distant, as though some barrier had risen between them and the world. They looked past each other, past the overseers, past the factory walls themselves, into a place no one else could see. A realm of constant flame, perhaps, or endless corridors filled with coughing shadows. They lived, but only half. The other half remained awake even in death, eyes open in the ashes. And you, if you tried to endure even a single shift, would feel it creeping in before noon. Your limbs would grow heavy, but rest would never come. The phosphorus stung too sharply, the fumes gnawed too fiercely, the endless rhythm battered too loudly. You would ache for the mercy of sleep, but the factory would not grant it. Your eyes would burn, lids trembling, but they would not close. Not when each blink might cost you your life, not when the overseer's cane waited to strike. The cruelest truth was this: the factory itself never slept. Fires smouldered even in the dark. Trays glistened with wet phosphorus through the night, and rats scurried along beams dusted with sulfur. The building had no silence, no stillness, no pause. And so neither did the people trapped inside it. That is why they said the match factory did not merely take lives, it borrowed them. It kept men, women, and children awake, long past the point of reason, holding their eyes open until the spark within finally burned out. Death was not sudden. It was a slow watching, a prolonged refusal of rest. The body collapsed only after the spirit had already withered, starved of the simplest human need, to close one's eyes without fear. And so, in the dim hours when the lantern light blurred into dawn, the workers shuffled back through the gates, eyes wide, unblinking, staring at nothing. They looked like ghosts even while breathing, hollow shells that refused to rest, vessels of exhaustion that sleep itself had abandoned, eyes that refused to close. That was the mark of the match factory, and that was why you would not last a single day within its walls. The match factory was more than its workshops. Beyond the dipping rooms, beyond the sulfur vats and phosphorus trays, there stretched a corridor where time itself seemed reluctant to pass. It was not a grand hall, but a narrow artery, lined with doors that led to storerooms, offices, and closets. Yet the workers spoke of it in hushed tones, as if it were a place set apart, a passageway that gathered the remnants of those who would never see their lives through to completion. The floorboards told the first story. They bore the imprint of dragging feet, scuffs from boots too heavy for the thin legs that wore them. Here and there, dark stains spread across the wood, some from spilled mixtures, others from blood coughed up in hurried silence. When the light from the high windows slanted across the boards, it revealed more, fingerprints in the dust, as though someone had once tried to hold on, clawing at the ground as they were taken away. It was along this corridor that many collapsed. The workshops demanded constant motion, and those who faltered too visibly were pushed out, urged to find their strength or else clear the way. They staggered here, leaning against the walls, leaving smears of sulfur on the plaster, leaving echoes of their shallow breaths. Sometimes they sat, their backs to the cold wood, their knees drawn up like children, and sometimes they did not rise again. The overseers hated the corridor. It interrupted efficiency, turned strong bodies into obstacles. When someone fell, they were dragged aside quickly, tucked into shadow, hidden from the eyes of those still working. Yet the memory of those moments clung to the air. The workers who passed through after could almost feel the presence of those left behind, as if the corridor had absorbed them. It became less a hallway and more a gallery of absences. Some whispered that the corridor remembered. They claimed to hear faint coughs when the wind pushed against the shutters to glimpse shadows where none should be. They said the eyes of the sleepless dead lingered there, still wide, still open, watching all who staggered through. And though most dismissed such talk as superstition, none walked the corridor without feeling it, the weight of unfinished lives pressing from both sides, urging them to hurry, to survive, though survival was never certain. It was in this passage that accidents often revealed their aftermath. A boy who had lost fingers to a tray of half-dried matches was pushed down its length, his hand wrapped in rags that turned red before he reached the end. A girl whose jaw had begun to rot from phosphorus sat slumped against the wall, her face turned away so the others would not see. A man who had breathed too deeply of the fumes staggered like a drunkard, his body convulsing before silence claimed him. They all found their way to the corridor, as if it were a final threshold. as if the building itself funneled the dying toward it. And when death came, it came quietly, no ceremony, no pause in the labor. The body was carried off, sometimes through the same doors where materials entered, sometimes down to the river where waste was discarded. The corridor was washed, scrubbed with lye. The stains lightened but never erased. Workers would arrive the next day, step across the damp boards, and know without being told that someone else's life had ended before it could finish its course. This was why the corridor felt endless, even though it stretched only a few dozen paces. Each life that faltered there lengthened it in memory, stretching it farther and farther into the darkness of the past. By the time one reached the other side, it seemed as though miles had been walked, each step pressing deeper into the silence left behind. Children feared it most. For them, the corridor was a prophecy. They passed through with wide eyes, clutching trays, wondering if their own futures ended here. Some hurried, refusing to look at the walls, while others lingered, peering into the shadows as though trying to see who waited there. The overseers shouted at both, the fearful for being too slow, the curious for dawdling. But no command could strip the corridor of its hold. It was a place where whispers lingered louder than orders. And you, if you walked there, would feel the chill instantly, not the cold of weather, but of presence, of countless lives halted mid-breath. The air would taste different, thicker, as though each inhalation borrowed from someone else's last. You would see the stains, faint but stubborn, and you would understand that scrubbing could never cleanse them. They were not marks of blood or poison alone. They were signatures of stories cut short. The corridor was not an accident of architecture. It was the spine of the factory, the passage where every truth collected. Here was where exhaustion revealed itself, where illness could no longer be hidden, where fire's survivors crawled before collapsing, where the overseer's cruelty was most visible in their haste to clear away the fallen. It was where the factory admitted, for a fleeting instant, that its work was measured not only in matches, but in bodies. Yet even in that admission, it offered no reprieve. The corridor was not a place of rest, only of delay. It did not hold funerals, only transitions. From labor to silence, from life to shadow, from name to absence. And still the work continued. Matches struck, orders filled, profits made. The lives ended in the corridor were simply folded into the cost of doing business. This was the truest cruelty. Not that the corridor existed, but that it was necessary. Without it, the factory could not function. It needed a place to hold the unfinished, to tuck them away so the rhythm of labor could remain uninterrupted. It was a sacrifice chamber, not of ritual, but of routine. Those who survived long enough grew accustomed to it. Their eyes no longer widened at the sight of someone slumped against the wall. Their steps no longer faltered when they passed a stain that had not yet dried. They learned to look forward, to pretend the corridor was empty, though their bodies tensed each time they crossed it. Habit dulled their terror, but it did not erase it. The corridor's truth could not be erased. And so, in the match factory, death did not always come with flames or sudden collapse. Often it began here, in this narrow space, in the stagger of a step or the slouch of weary shoulders. Here was where lives trailed off, where eyes dulled, where breaths shallowed into silence. Lives unfinished, halted not by choice, but by the grind of work that consumed them faster than time itself. If you entered this passage, you would not last. The weight of unfinished lives would press on your chest. The air thick with memory would choke you. The silence between footsteps would gnaw at your mind. You would walk those few dozen paces and emerge changed, carrying the knowledge that in a place built to make flame, human lives were extinguished like splinters of wood, their light gone before it ever had a chance to burn. That corridor did not end when you stepped out of it. It followed, invisible, clinging like the smell of phosphorus. It reminded every worker that their lives, too, were already unfinished, that they walked with one foot in labor and the other in absence. And the factory knew it. The factory counted on it. That is why the corridor of unfinished lives still stretches endlessly in memory. And that is why you would not last a day in a match factory. Stone and timber crumble, beams rot, roofs sag. Yet the match factory endured, long after the men, women and children who fed it had been carried away in silence. It stood, scarred but unyielding, a carcass that refused to decay. Its walls absorbed not just the sulfur dust and phosphorus fumes, but the breath and blood of thousands whose names had already faded. The workers aged and died, but the factory remained, as though it had been built not by men, but by hunger itself. Factories are supposed to serve. They are meant to rise, labor, and then fall silent once their purpose is finished. But this one betrayed that rhythm. It became more than a workplace. It became a body that consumed other bodies, and when those bodies failed, it simply demanded replacements. Children became adults. Adults withered into corpses, and still the machines rattled. Each generation imagined it was the last to endure its cruelty, and each was wrong. The factory outlived them because it was never truly theirs. It belonged to the overseers who counted matches, not the fingers that dipped them. It belonged to the owners who tallied profits, not the lungs that inhaled the fumes. To those men, the workers were not people but fuel, no different from the phosphorus and sulfur they handled. When one life guttered out, another was pressed into service. The ledger never recorded the dead, only the matches mattered. In time, the building itself began to look like the people it had devoured. Its bricks were jaundiced with yellow stains, like the skin of those poisoned within. Its windows fogged over with soot, as clouded as the eyes of the sleepless dead. The roof sagged like a weary spine, and still it lived, breathing out fumes each dawn, exhaling smoke into the city's air, announcing to all who passed that it was still hungry. The city grew around it, but the factory did not change. New streets were laid, new shops opened, new fashions arrived. Yet within those gates, time froze. Children still trudged in before dawn. Women still dipped splints in vats. Men still shouldered crates until their backs broke. The same stench, the same cough, the same terror of flame. A century could pass, and a visitor returning would find it unchanged, as if the building mocked the very idea of progress. And in this persistence lay its cruelty. Workers lived brief, brittle lives, their bodies crumbling before they ever grew old. But the factory aged slowly, methodically, never in danger of collapse. Its walls remained upright, its beams were patched, its machines oiled. It was cared for better than the people inside it. While they rotted in silence, the building was preserved. Some said it was cursed, but curses end. This was worse. It was efficient. Death had been woven into its foundations, not as punishment, but as design. Its endurance was proof that suffering, when made profitable, outlasts the sufferers. And you, if you were to step inside, even now, would feel it. The boards would creak beneath your feet, and though the workers themselves are long gone, you would not feel alone. The air would still taste faintly of phosphorus, faintly of smoke, faintly of the flesh that burned in its fires. Each sound, each drip of water, each sigh of wind through cracks, would echo like a cough. The factory waits, even when empty, because it does not need workers to live. It needs memory, and memory it has in abundance. The walls remember every scream, every fall, every shuffle of tired feet. The beams remember the sparks that lit them. The floors remember the stains. The factory itself became an archive, a museum not of tools or machines, but of unfinished lives. And as long as it stands, those lives are never free. The greatest cruelty is that the workers were forgotten, but the factory was not. Their names slipped from records. Their graves went unmarked, their stories dissolved into silence. Yet the building remains, studied, described, preserved. The overseers, the owners, even the city itself may have believed they built something great. But what they built was hunger made brick and beam, and it outlasted every one of them. To see it now is to see a contradiction. The doors are shut, the machines stilled, yet the sense of labor hangs thick. It feels as if, at any moment, the bell might toll and the gates might open, and the children of the dead would shuffle back in, carrying the same trays, coughing the same blood. History feels less like the past than the present, stretched unbearably long. The factory outlives not only its workers, but also Kim itself. And here lies the truth. You would not last a day in such a place, not because the labor was too heavy, nor the fumes too sharp, nor the fire too sudden, though all were true. You would not last because the factory itself is stronger than you, stronger than lungs, stronger than bones, stronger than memory. You would enter as countless did before, thinking yourself alive, and leave as countless did before, consumed by something that does not die. The match factory endured because endurance was its nature. To create flame, it had to embody flame. Hungry, devouring, eternal. Its workers were sparks, brief and vanishing. It was the fire. And fires, once fed enough, do not die easily. So the gates still stand. The windows still stare. The walls still lean forward as though listening for footsteps. And if you walk through, the factory would welcome you as it welcomed all before you. It would press its stench into your skin. It would steal your sleep. It would hollow your eyes. It would bend your spine. And when your life was spent, it would let you fall in silence and wait for another. That is how the factory outlived its workers. That is why you would not last a day. And so, tonight's journey ends where it began, inside the shadow of a factory that devoured more than just hours. We walked through its iron gates, saw faces hidden beneath sulfur dust, heard the coughs that rattled through its corridors, and felt the sting of a fire that never needed striking. We learned why a single day here was enough to wither a body, why even the strongest spirit bent under the weight of phosphorus, hunger, and silence. These weren't just workers, they were children who never grew old, women who returned home with bones aching like they carried fire inside them, men whose names were lost beneath ledgers filled with numbers. They gave their breath, their teeth, their skin, and the factory outlived them all. Now I want to hear from you. In the comments, tell me what part of this journey struck you the hardest. Was it the yellow dust clinging to their clothes? The meals that turned to powder? The shadows coughing blood? Or the endless bell that always rang too late? Your reflections become part of this history, a way of keeping their voices alive in a world that so often forgets. Before you leave tonight, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel so these stories can reach further, maybe even into the homes of your own family, reminding us all of the price hidden behind everyday things. And don't forget to share your location and the time you're watching this. It's one of my favorite things, to imagine your light scattered across the world, glowing like stars, while we gather here to remember the forgotten. Until next time, keep your eyes open, your lamps burning, and never forget, some factories swallowed lives whole, and yet their silence still speaks.